Arrogant millionaire kicks his daughter out of the house, a story of pride and transformation. Richard Whitmore had everything a man could dream of, an empire of wealth, a sprawling mansion, and the respect of high society. Yet, despite his fortune, his heart was as cold and unyielding as the walls of his estate. To Richard, success was measured in dollars and status, and he demanded the same values from his only daughter, Emily. But Emily's heart longed for something money couldn't buy, love. When Emily fell in love with Michael, a humble farmer, Richard's world was shaken. To him, Michael represented everything he despised: simplicity, poverty, and a lack of ambition. Refusing to bless their union, Richard issued an ultimatum: abandon Michael or be disowned forever. To his shock, Emily chose love, walking away from her life of privilege to start anew with Michael on his modest farm. The rift left Richard consumed by anger and loneliness, convinced that Emily would regret her decision and return, begging for forgiveness. But as days turned to months, doubts began to creep into his mind. Was it possible that he was wrong? Could love and simplicity hold a value greater than all his wealth? What unfolds is a journey of separation, reconciliation, and the search for true happiness. Will Richard find the strength to mend what pride has broken? Dive into this moving story of love, family, and redemption to find out. The Whitmore mansion stood like a fortress atop the hill, its towering gates and pristine gardens a testament to Richard Whitmore's unyielding pursuit of wealth and power. Inside, Richard sat in his study, his sharp features etched with frustration. His graying hair was combed back neatly, and his tailored suit reflected his unwavering control over every aspect of his life. But tonight, his control was slipping. Across from him, his daughter Emily sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her auburn hair framed her delicate face, and her blue eyes, usually filled with warmth, now shimmered with defiance. The opulent room, lined with leather-bound books and antique furniture, felt stifling as the silence between them grew heavier. "I won't allow it," Richard said finally, his voice cold and firm. "You're throwing your life away for a man who has nothing to offer you." "Michael has plenty to offer me, father," Emily replied, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "He gives me love, kindness, and respect, things money can't buy." Richard scoffed, rising from his chair and pacing the room. "Love?" he spat. "Love doesn't pay the bills, Emily. It doesn't build a future. That man is a farmer, he'll never be able to provide for you the way I have." Emily stood, her petite frame trembling but resolute. "I don't need wealth to be happy. I need a life that's real, a life where I'm loved for who I am, not for the fortune tied to my name." Richard turned to face her, his expression hardening. "If you leave with him, you'll lose everything, your inheritance, your status, your family. Is that what you want?" Emily's heart broke at his words, but she refused to let him see her cry. "I don't want to lose you, father," she said quietly. "But I can't give up on the love I've found." Richard's face darkened. "Then you're no longer my daughter." That night, Emily packed her belongings into a small suitcase. The mansion, once a symbol of security and comfort, now felt like a gilded cage she was desperate to escape. As she stepped into the grand foyer, her mother's portrait loomed above the staircase, a reminder of the warmth their home had lost since her passing. Michael waited for her outside, his sturdy frame silhouetted against the moonlit sky. His simple clothes and calloused hands stood in stark contrast to the polished world Emily was leaving behind, but his eyes were filled with unwavering devotion. "Are you sure about this, Emily?" he asked, his voice gentle yet firm. "You're giving up so much." Emily took his hand, her grip firm. "I'm sure. What I'm gaining is worth far more than what I'm leaving behind." As they walked away from the mansion, the sound of the heavy iron gates closing behind them felt final, like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Inside the mansion, Richard stood by the window, watching his daughter disappear into the night. His chest tightened with an unfamiliar pain, but he pushed it aside, convincing himself that she would soon realize her mistake and come crawling back. The silence in the house deepened, the grandeur of his wealth suddenly feeling hollow. Richard poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling in the crystal tumbler. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth doing little to chase away the chill in his heart. He convinced himself that he was right, that Emily would understand the foolishness of her decision once the hardships of farm life set in. Yet, as the night wore on, doubts began to creep in, like whispers he couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Emily and Michael arrived at the small family farm. The wooden farmhouse, though modest, exuded a sense of warmth and welcome. The scent of hay and freshly tilled soil filled the air, a stark contrast to the sterile opulence of the mansion Emily had left behind. Michael opened the creaky door, letting Emily step inside. The interior was simple but cozy, a worn sofa, a wooden table, and curtains that fluttered gently in the breeze. "It's not much," Michael said, scratching the back of his neck. "But it's home." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "It's perfect." As they settled in for the night, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The distant sound of crickets and the soft rustle of leaves outside lulled her to sleep, her heart full of hope for the life she was about to build. Back at the mansion, Richard sat alone in the grand dining room, the long table empty except for his untouched plate. The clinking of his fork against the porcelain echoed in the vast space, a sharp reminder of the solitude he now faced. Despite his efforts to convince himself otherwise, the house felt colder without Emily's presence. As the clock struck midnight, Richard retired to his bedroom, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the last conversation with Emily. For the first time in years, he felt a pang of regret, but his pride refused to let him acknowledge it. And so, the night passed, leaving father and daughter on opposite ends of a chasm created by love, pride, and the choices they had made. Morning sunlight streamed through the small window of the farmhouse, illuminating the modest room where Emily lay. The chirping of birds outside and the distant moo of cows replaced the sound of bustling maids and clinking silverware she had grown accustomed to. For a moment, she lay still, letting the unfamiliar quiet settle over her. It was a new kind of peace, one she hadn't realized she'd been longing for. Downstairs, Michael was already at work, his voice humming a cheerful tune as he prepared breakfast. The smell of sizzling eggs and fresh bread filled the air, and Emily smiled despite the ache in her muscles from yesterday's journey. She pulled on a simple dress and made her way to the kitchen, where Michael greeted her with a warm smile. "Good morning," he said, setting a steaming cup of coffee in front of her. His brown eyes sparkled with an energy that seemed to radiate from within. "Ready for your first full day on the farm?" Emily chuckled nervously, brushing a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "I don't know if I'm ready, but I'll do my best." The day began early, and Emily quickly realized how different her new life would be. The tasks were endless, feeding the animals, gathering eggs, and helping Michael repair a broken fence. At first, her hands fumbled with the unfamiliar tools, and the sheer physicality of the work left her breathless. But Michael's patient guidance and gentle encouragement kept her going. "You're doing great," he said, handing her a fresh bucket of water from the well. "It's not about perfection, it's about effort." By midday, Emily's arms ached, and dirt smudged her once pristine dress. She wiped the sweat from her brow, glancing at Michael, who worked tirelessly beside her. His shirt was damp with sweat, and his hands moved with practiced ease, yet he never complained. The pride he took in his work was evident, and Emily found herself admiring his resilience. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the couple sat on the porch, enjoying a simple dinner of fresh vegetables and bread. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of the fields. Emily leaned back in her chair, gazing at the stars beginning to dot the night sky. "It's beautiful out here," she murmured. Michael smiled, his gaze fixed on her. "It is. But it's even better with you here." Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest. Despite the physical exhaustion, she was content in a way she hadn't been before. The simplicity of farm life, though challenging, brought her a sense of fulfillment that wealth and luxury never had. Meanwhile, back at the Whitmore mansion, Richard's life continued as it always had, on the surface, at least. The grand halls were as immaculate as ever, and the staff moved about with their usual precision. But the silence that now filled the house was deafening. Richard sat in his study, a stack of papers in front of him, but his mind wandered to Emily. He had expected her to return by now, to admit defeat and beg for forgiveness. Instead, weeks had passed with no word from her. His pride wouldn't allow him to admit it, but he missed her presence. The house felt emptier without her laughter echoing through the halls. As the days turned into weeks, Richard found himself retreating further into his solitude. His evenings were spent alone in the cavernous dining room, the sound of his fork against the plate a stark reminder of the loneliness he had brought upon himself. Yet, even as regret gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, his pride kept him from reaching out. Back at the farm, Emily was beginning to adjust to her new routine. Though the work was still hard, her body grew stronger, and she started to find joy in the small victories, like successfully milking a cow for the first time or baking bread that didn't burn. Michael was always by her side, his unwavering support making every challenge feel surmountable. One evening, as they walked hand in hand through the fields, Michael turned to her, his expression serious. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly. "Leaving everything behind?" Emily stopped and looked at him, her blue eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Not for a second," she said firmly. "What I have now is worth more than anything I left behind." Michael smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "You're incredible, Emily." As the couple continued to build their life together, Richard's internal struggle grew. The vast wealth and power that once defined him now felt hollow. For the first time, he began to question whether his fortune was worth the cost of his relationship with Emily. Yet, even as these doubts crept in, his pride refused to let him admit his mistake. In the quiet of his mansion, Richard often found himself standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. Somewhere out there, his daughter was building a life without him, and the thought filled him with a mix of anger and sorrow. He told himself she would come back eventually, but deep down, he wondered if he had driven her away forever. As time passed, the contrast between Emily's life on the farm and Richard's life in the mansion grew sharper. While Emily found fulfillment in the simplicity of love and labor, Richard remained trapped in his gilded cage, his pride the only thing keeping him company. Both father and daughter were on journeys of their own, Emily toward a life of contentment and Richard toward a reckoning he could no longer avoid. The question remained, would their paths ever cross again? It was a crisp autumn morning when Emily sat by the window in the farmhouse, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. The fields outside were a patchwork of gold and brown, a testament to the changing seasons. Michael was out in the barn, tending to the animals, and the peaceful quiet of the farm surrounded her. But Emily's thoughts were far from calm. Her heart ached for the man she had left behind, her father. Emily set the cup down and pulled out a sheet of paper, smoothing it carefully on the wooden table. The words didn't come easily at first, but as she stared at the blank page, memories of her childhood flooded back. She remembered the nights her father would tuck her in with a rare but warm smile, the pride in his eyes when she aced her school exams, and the quiet moments they had shared after her mother's passing. Those moments felt like lifetimes ago, buried under layers of hurt and misunderstanding. "It has been months since I left, and not a day goes by that I don't think of you. Life on the farm is different from the one I knew, but I want you to know that I am happy. Michael and I have built a life together, one filled with love, simplicity, and peace. I know you don't agree with my choice, and perhaps you never will. But, Father, I don't regret it. For the first time, I feel truly alive, free from the weight of expectations and the constant need to prove my worth. I miss you, Father. Despite everything, I have always loved and admired you. I hope one day we can find our way back to each other." Until then, know that you are in my heart every day. Love. Emily. Emily folded the letter neatly and placed it in an envelope. She hesitated before sealing it, her fingers brushing over the paper. She wasn't sure if her father would read it, or if he even cared, but it was a risk she was willing to take. She addressed the envelope to the Whitmore estate and handed it to Michael. "Are you sure about this?" Michael asked gently, his brow furrowed with concern. Emily nodded. "He needs to know how I feel, even if he doesn't respond." Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're brave, Emily. Whatever happens, you've done your part." At the Whitmore mansion, Richard sat in his study, the fire crackling in the hearth. The envelope bearing Emily's familiar handwriting was on his desk. He had stared at it for hours, torn between curiosity and stubborn pride. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he picked it up and broke the seal. As he read Emily's words, his chest tightened. Her voice leapt off the page, full of warmth and sincerity. The love she expressed was undeniable, but so was the pain woven between the lines. For the first time, Richard saw beyond his own anger and pride, glimpsing the daughter who had always longed for his approval. Richard placed the letter down, his hands trembling slightly. Memories of Emily as a little girl filled his mind, her laughter echoing through the halls, her bright eyes lighting up whenever he came home. He realized, with a pang of regret, how much he had lost by letting his ego come between them. Over the following days, Richard found himself returning to the letter, rereading it late at night when the silence of the mansion was most suffocating. Her words haunted him, forcing him to confront truths he had avoided for months. He had driven away the one person who truly loved him, not for his wealth but for who he was. Finally, after much deliberation, Richard made a decision. He could no longer ignore the ache in his heart or the growing sense that he had been wrong. He would go to Emily, not to demand her return, but to seek her forgiveness. The morning Richard left for the farm was overcast, the sky heavy with clouds. Dressed in a simple coat and scarf, he carried little more than the letter and a deep sense of uncertainty. The drive out of the city was long, the sprawling estates and towering skyscrapers gradually giving way to rolling fields and quiet countryside. As the car approached the farmhouse, Richard's stomach churned with nerves. The modest home stood in stark contrast to the opulence he was accustomed to, but there was a warmth to it that he couldn't deny. He stepped out of the car, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel driveway. Inside, Emily was folding laundry when she heard the knock at the door. She froze, her heart leaping to her throat. Wiping her hands on her apron, she walked cautiously to the door and opened it. The sight of her father standing there, looking older and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him, left her momentarily speechless. "Father," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard cleared his throat, his usual confidence replaced by hesitation. "Emily," he began, his tone uncharacteristically soft. "I received your letter." Emily's grip tightened on the doorframe. "And?" Richard sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I was wrong. About everything. I came to tell you. I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, Emily stepped aside, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Come in." As Richard stepped into the farmhouse, he felt the weight of his pride begin to lift. The warmth of the home, the simple decor, and the faint smell of freshly baked bread filled him with a strange sense of peace. For the first time, he began to understand what Emily had been trying to tell him all along. Here, in this modest house, was a life built on love, trust, and genuine happiness, a life he had been too blind to see. Their journey toward reconciliation had begun, but the road ahead would not be easy. Yet, for the first time in months, both father and daughter felt the faint stirrings of hope. The farmhouse living room was small but cozy, with its worn furniture and walls adorned with framed photographs of simpler times. Richard stood awkwardly in the center of the room, his polished shoes and tailored coat an odd contrast to the rustic surroundings. Emily busied herself in the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she poured tea into two mismatched mugs. Michael appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a cloth. His broad shoulders filled the frame, but his expression was calm and welcoming. "Mr. Whitmore," he said with a slight nod, his voice steady. "It's good to see you." Richard turned, catching the sincerity in Michael's tone. For a moment, he felt the old surge of judgment rise within him. The farmer's plain clothes, rough hands, and unassuming demeanor stood in stark contrast to everything Richard valued. But before he could speak, Emily returned with the tea, setting it down on the wooden table. "Please, sit," she said, motioning to the couch. Richard hesitated but finally lowered himself onto the worn cushions. Emily and Michael sat across from him, and the silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotions. Richard cleared his throat, his gaze dropping to the steaming cup in his hands. "I owe you both an apology," he began, his voice low but sincere. "Emily, I was wrong to force you to choose. And Michael, I misjudged you. I see now that my pride blinded me." Emily's breath hitched, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. Michael reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Thank you, Father," she said softly. "That means more than you know." Richard looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers. "I let my fear of losing you cloud my judgment. When your mother passed, I promised myself I'd give you the best life possible. But I forgot that a good life isn't just about wealth or status, it's about love and happiness." Michael leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle. "Mr. Whitmore, I know I'm not the kind of man you imagine for Emily. But I love her, and I'd do anything to make her happy." Richard studied Michael for a long moment. There was no defensiveness in his words, no bravado, just quiet determination. For the first time, Richard saw the strength in Michael's simplicity, the kind of strength that couldn't be measured by wealth or power. The conversation that followed was tentative but honest. Emily shared stories of her life on the farm, the challenges, the joys, and the deep sense of fulfillment she had found. Michael chimed in occasionally, his quiet pride evident in the way he spoke about their work and their dreams. Richard listened, his preconceived notions slowly unraveling with each word. The love between Emily and Michael was undeniable, and the life they had built together, though humble, was rich in ways he had never understood. As the evening wore on, the tension began to ease. Laughter broke through the awkwardness as Emily recounted a mishap involving a stubborn goat and Michael's less than graceful attempts to handle it. Even Richard couldn't suppress a chuckle, the sound surprising them all. Later, as Emily cleared the table, Richard stepped outside, needing a moment to himself. The night air was crisp, and the stars shone brightly against the inky sky. He wandered to the edge of the field, the soft rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets filling the silence. Michael joined him a few minutes later, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. "It's peaceful out here, isn't it?" he said, his tone conversational. Richard nodded. "It is. I can see why Emily loves it here." Michael hesitated before speaking again. "Mr. Whitmore, I know it wasn't easy for you to come here. But I'm glad you did. Emily loves you, and no matter what's happened, you're still her father." Richard's chest tightened at Michael's words. He turned to face the younger man, his voice quiet but firm. "You're a good man, Michael. Better than I gave you credit for." Michael smiled, his relief evident. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." Inside the farmhouse, Emily watched from the window, her heart swelling with hope. For months, she had dreamed of this moment, a chance for her father to see her life for what it truly was and to accept her choices. When the two men returned, the atmosphere was lighter, the air of tension replaced by a sense of mutual understanding. Emily hugged her father tightly before he left, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for coming, Father," she whispered. "It means everything to me." Richard held her close, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll come back, Emily. I promise." As he drove away from the farm, Richard felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The pride that had once consumed him seemed smaller now, replaced by a quiet sense of clarity. He had lost so much, but for the first time, he felt he had a chance to reclaim what truly mattered. And so, the seeds of healing were planted, with love and understanding paving the way for a new chapter in their lives. Weeks turned into months, and true to his word, Richard returned to the farm regularly. Each visit brought him closer to the life Emily and Michael had built, a life he had once dismissed but now deeply admired. The rigid lines of Richard's face softened as he spent more time in the countryside, learning the rhythms of a world far removed from the corporate boardrooms and luxurious halls he once dominated. One crisp morning, Richard stood beside Michael in the barn, a pitchfork in hand. His expensive coat and shoes had been swapped for a simple jacket and sturdy boots, though the awkwardness in his movements betrayed his inexperience. Michael chuckled, demonstrating how to properly spread hay for the cattle. "You're getting the hang of it, Mr. Whitmore," Michael said with a grin. Richard paused, his brow furrowed. "Call me Richard," he said, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "I think we've earned that much." Michael nodded, his respect for the older man growing with each passing day. Despite their rocky start, Richard's willingness to adapt and learn spoke volumes about his transformation. Inside the farmhouse, Emily prepared lunch, her heart full as she watched her father and husband working together through the window. The simple life she had chosen now felt complete with her father's presence. Their conversations had grown more open, more honest, and Richard no longer shied away from admitting his past mistakes. At the dining table, over bowls of hearty stew and freshly baked bread, laughter often filled the air. Richard shared stories of his youth, tales of determination that mirrored the grit Michael displayed every day on the farm. In return, Emily and Michael taught him the joys of simplicity, how a sunrise over the fields could rival the grandeur of any gala, or how the sound of the wind rustling through the crops could bring a peace no amount of money could buy. One evening, as the three sat on the porch watching the sunset, Richard broke the comfortable silence. "I used to think happiness came with a price tag," he admitted, his voice thoughtful. "That the only way to live a good life was to build walls high enough to keep the world out." Michael glanced at him, his expression understanding. "And now?" Richard smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Now I see that I was wrong. Happiness isn't about what you own, it's about who you share your life with. And you've shown me that, both of you." Emily reached for her father's hand, her eyes shining with gratitude. "We're glad you're here, Father. This is how it was always meant to be." In the weeks that followed, Richard became an integral part of their small family. He helped Michael repair fences, attended local farmers' markets, and even learned to bake bread under Emily's patient guidance, though his first few attempts left much to be desired. The once proud millionaire found joy in the little things, the warmth of a shared meal, the satisfaction of a hard day's work, and the love that bound them all together. Back at the Whitmore mansion, the grand halls stood silent, their opulence dimmed by Richard's growing absence. He visited less frequently, finding little comfort in the sterile luxury that had once defined his life. Instead, he began selling off parts of his vast empire, using the proceeds to support causes close to his heart, community farms, local schools, and programs for underprivileged families. The transformation in Richard didn't go unnoticed. At a local town gathering, one of the neighbors approached Emily. "Your father's a changed man," she said warmly. "I never thought I'd see Richard Whitmore lending a hand at a bake sale." Emily laughed, her heart swelling with pride. "Neither did I. But sometimes, all it takes is love to bring out the best in people." Months later, on a sunny spring afternoon, the farm was alive with activity as neighbors and friends gathered for a celebration. It was the anniversary of Emily and Michael's wedding, and the farmhouse buzzed with laughter and music. Richard stood among the crowd, his eyes filled with joy as he watched his daughter and son-in-law dance under the open sky. As the festivities wound down, Emily approached her father, wrapping her arms around him. "Thank you for being here, father," she said softly. "For everything." Richard hugged her tightly, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given me more than I could ever repay, Emily. You've given me back my family." That evening, as the stars blanketed the sky, Richard sat alone on the porch, a cup of tea in his hands. The quiet of the farm wrapped around him like a comforting embrace, and for the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. The life he had once scorned had become his salvation, teaching him the value of love, humility, and connection. The once proud millionaire had found something far more valuable than wealth. He had found himself. Richard never returned to his old life. Instead, he became a pillar of the community, known not for his fortune but for his kindness and generosity. Emily and Michael's farm flourished, not just as a place of work but as a home filled with love and laughter. Together, they proved that true happiness lies not in riches, but in the bonds we nurture and the lives we touch. And so, the story of Richard, Emily, and Michael stands as a testament to the transformative power of love, family, and the courage to embrace change. Richard's journey from a cold, prideful millionaire to a man who found peace and joy in simplicity is a powerful reminder that the most valuable things in life aren't measured in dollars or status. This story speaks to the transformative power of love, the importance of family, and the courage to let go of pride to embrace what truly matters. Emily's unwavering faith in her choices and Michael's steadfast love show us that happiness comes from living authentically, surrounded by those who care for us unconditionally. At its heart, this is a story about redemption, how even the deepest divides can be bridged when we choose understanding over judgment, humility over arrogance, and love over fear. It challenges us to ask, what truly makes us happy? Is it wealth and power, or the quiet moments of connection and love that enrich our souls? What about you? Are there relationships in your life that need healing? Are you chasing things that might not bring you lasting happiness? Let this story inspire you to reevaluate your priorities and embrace the relationships that matter most. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder of what truly matters in life. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiring and heartwarming stories like this. Together, let's spread messages of love, hope, and transformation to the world. Click subscribe, and let's make a difference, one story at a time.